Hello, and welcome to the Boston Globe Sustainability Week. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to thank our underwriters for their support. Philips, our presenting sponsor, as well as the International Business School at Brandeis University and the Museum of Science. On behalf of all of us, we hope you enjoy the program.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Globe Sustainability Week and our discussion on the carbon-free house of 2030. My name is Eileen McElhaney Woods. I'm the editor of Address, the Globe's Sunday real estate section, and of Boston.com's real estate coverage, and the author of the Free Address newsletter. I'm honored today to be joined by our panelists. Our expert panelists are Nick Falkoff, principal of the green building firm Auburndale Builders in Newton, Ira Shore, Executive Director of Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships and a go-to person on clean energy policy, and Christopher Porter, Director of Customer Energy Management at National Grid in New England. Welcome, panelists.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
I'd like to start our discussion off with something a little taxing, but necessary. I think there are some green building terms out there that are confusing to some folks. I know that I have some issues with them, and I'm hoping that you can define them for us. Those terms being the differences between net zero, passive house construction, and LEED certification. Nick, you want to start us off, please?
Sure. So passive house is a building standard that came over from Germany to the US, and there's basically 5 passive principles. It's an airtight building, it's thermally bridge free, has high performance windows and doors, balanced ventilation, and it has what's the 5th one? I'm going to forget now, but there's a standard, and we apply the 5 standards, and you can use passive house principles without certifying. So that's so if you say a passive house, but the big thing is it's passively heated and cooled using the sun and using solar orientation. So a passive house doesn't use as much energy. And a LEED building is leadership in energy and efficient design. And LEED is a very holistic standard that looks not just at the energy usage of a building, but also at the location of the building near transport, at water usage, at material sourcing, at a number of other things. So it's very holistic, where passive house really looks at the energy usage. And then a net zero house, that means if you look at your electric bill at the end of the year, a net zero house, you would have put as much energy back into the grid as you pulled off the grid. So we say passive house is the best way to build net zero. You build a really well super insulated house with good windows and doors, and that's the best way to set yourself up for net zero. So you hear these phrases thrown around a lot, and people often wonder what's better, and they're all good. It's just, and we use bits and pieces of it each building, but they're all evolving standards. They've all changed many times over the years, and they're going to continue to change.
And I think Nick makes go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to weigh in on net zero from a policy perspective, because the term net zero is used a lot locally, at the state level, and also nationally for policy framing. And it gets even more complicated at that level, because sometimes people are talking about net zero energy. Sometimes they're talking about net zero emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And it's often undefined. Like in Massachusetts, we have climate laws that require us to get to net zero carbon economy wide, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every home or every building will be net zero. And it also means that, as Nick said, you're balancing the energy in, energy out, or the carbon in, carbon out, but you're not necessarily at a zero carbon all the time for every building or every sector. So it gets even more complicated, and there's no standard definition that policy is based around.
No, that's right. Just building on one point that Nick made that I think is an important point, is that thinking specifically about net zero energy consumption, theoretically, any building could be net zero. If you put a large enough, sort of energy generating system on that building, that's a path to net zero. But the right way to get to net zero, and certainly the most cost efficient way for homeowners, is you start with those passive house principles. You start with designing a house that is as energy efficient as possible, that uses as little energy as possible, and then you can appropriately size the generating system to meet the needs of that house. And that's just going to be the most cost efficient path for a homeowner who's interested in getting to net zero to get to net zero from an energy perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. And given that we have the second oldest housing stock in the US, there are a lot of concerns. I hear a lot of concerns about retrofitting old homes to be energy efficient and so forth. What are some of the challenges that folks who want to do this might face?
Sure, I'm happy to start there. And I think, you know, we are blessed in Massachusetts to live in such a historic area with so much history and so many beautiful older homes. That does come with challenges, though, in terms of retrofitting those homes. Oftentimes, you know, older homes aren't going to be insulated or have as tight a thermal envelope as you'd see in a more modern home. Oftentimes, they don't have the ductwork already built that would support sort of the most energy efficient heating systems and mechanical systems to keep that building, that home, warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And then additionally, oftentimes we find, you know, within older homes, there are what we refer to as pre-weatherization barriers. So knob and tube wiring, vermiculite, aspects of how that house was constructed that make it more difficult to do the sort of bread and butter kind of insulation work or weatherization work that is necessary in order to make that home as energy efficient as possible. Now, you know, we have the tools to address those challenges. They just add cost. They just make it, you know, and time for the homeowner in order to address and mitigate those barriers.
Right.
So anything is possible. It just it typically can be a little bit more difficult when dealing with an older home than in a new construction situation or in working with a homeowner or a home that was built more recently.
Now,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, you know, we have such a long and great history of energy efficiency work here in the Commonwealth and dealing with our housing stock. And there are barriers, but there are so many opportunities. I mean, many of these homes are completely uninsulated. As Chris said, they have pre-weatherization barriers, which aren't just barriers to weatherization, they're also health and safety concerns. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to retrofit and increase comfort and health outcomes in our housing stock. And that's particularly true when we're talking about the most disadvantaged communities and the oldest and least well-maintained housing stock. So there is a lot of opportunity that goes beyond pure energy efficiency.
And when you think about the opportunity, but also the cost, I know that there are quasi-public organizations like Mass Save that offer rebates and incentives and so forth. Chris, you're quite knowledgeable about that. Could you expand on that for us, please?
Absolutely. And, you know, in Massachusetts, I think we're rightfully proud of the fact that over the last 10 to 15 years, you know, with support of the legislature, with support of policymakers and regulators, you know, we have built really the most ambitious, and we've delivered on these goals, the most ambitious energy efficiency programs in the country. And so our Mass Save programs, which is the brand through which we educate and engage customers about these offerings, are really built around, first, helping customers to save money on their energy bills by supporting their investments. And then, and as importantly, also helping customers to meet sustainability goals or decarbonization goals for themselves, for their families, for their businesses, and then in support of broader policy goals. And so, you know, we really support the market in a number of ways. In our new construction programs, we offer access to an independent network of experts who can advise homeowners and builders on strategies and techniques and tools in order to build as energy efficient a home as possible. And then recognizing that, you know, while those techniques will save customers money over time, they sometimes do come with higher upfront costs. And so providing upfront incentives to help to mitigate some of those higher upfront costs. And just this year, we've launched some new all-electric home programs where we can provide up to $25,000 per home of support for builders and or customers who are able and desire to make the investments to build a very tight home that uses high efficiency electric heating and cooking appliances and hot water appliances, and is wired for charging of an electric vehicle. On the retrofit side, so in situations where you got a customer in an existing home, really the pathway to engaging there starts with the home energy assessment. So it's a no cost to customer program. We can send someone out, we can do it virtually. And really an expert will spend a couple of hours with the homeowner going through your home, identifying opportunities to increase the efficiency of that home. Oftentimes we can implement measures instantly, on site that will drive immediate savings. And then we can also identify opportunities for larger savings, whether it's an upgraded insulation project or an upgraded, more efficient HVAC system. And we provide incentives on those programs as well for installation, typically up to about 75% of the cost of installation work. And then for heating systems, it really depends on the size of the system and what the customer is looking to do. But as much as $10,000 or $15,000 for a customer who's looking to fully convert to either an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump to meet the full heating and cooling needs of their home.
Speaking of the geothermal heating, the heat pumps, we actually just had a home energy audit looking to get those. And the technician told me that there are, in some cases, you can't do a whole house, heat a whole home with geothermal. You have to have oil as a backup. Is that correct?
All right, do you want to start there? Do you want me to take that one?
I'll start, and I would say, I think you're teasing out two issues here. One is the constraints around geothermal, and those tend to be space constraints. So I live in Somerville. I have very little land around my house. There's not enough room for me to build a geothermal system big enough to heat my home. But then there's the technology of cold climate heat pumps, and I would say that is not correct. That around the world, air source heat pumps are being installed primarily in cold climates, Sweden, Germany, northern Japan. They are extremely highly efficient, they're extremely effective, and they can provide whole house heating and cooling. So I would say those are the two different issues. And I have something else to say about geothermal, but I'll hold it for now and see if Nick and Chris want to weigh in.
Yeah, there used to be, when clients ask about geothermal, unless you're already drilling a well, like out in like Wayland or Weston or something, to bring in a drilling rig and to do all that cost and set it all up, it's a big cost, it takes space. And so when people talk about geothermal, we say just do the air source heat pumps. You can take the heat out of the ground or you can take it out of the air. It's much less expensive, much easier to maintain to just do air source heat pumps. So, and Chris mentioned the new Mass Save rebates. There's a $10,000 rebate for the Mass Save heat pumps, so it makes it even easier to go to the air source heat pumps.
That's right. And I agree with everything that's been said so far. Maybe all I'd add to that, I think, as the sponsors of Mass Save, what we believe is that the path to a good experience with your heating and cooling system starts with weatherization. Have a tight building envelope, have a well-insulated, well-weatherized home. And then independent of what heating system, technology, or fuel you choose to use, you're likely to save money because you'll require a more appropriately sized system, and then you'll have to run that system in a more efficient way or just less and it'll cost you less to operate. For buildings that are tightly and appropriately weatherized, completely agree with Ara that while heat pump technology, I imagine, feels new, particularly in Massachusetts to many customers, it's really not a new technology. It has been demonstrated in climates all over the world that it can, meet the full heating and cooling needs of an appropriately weatherized home. That said, there likely will be situations either where that home, it's difficult to completely weatherize in a cost-efficient way, or other situations where a customer might choose not to fully convert their system to either a ground source or an air source heat pump, to use that system for partial, what we call partial displacement. So you use it during shoulder seasons or for a portion of the house. You retain the backup heating system for use during, the coldest days of the winter. Really, I think, the answer there is that it's difficult to generalize, and really would just urge customers to work with a licensed contractor, work with a plumber, with their HVAC technician, and design something and a solution for their home that meets their needs, and is the best solution given sort of the specific sort of their goals and the specific layout of the home.
I would definitely repeat that. I don't think it can be said enough that energy efficiency is the first step on retrofitting a home. Whatever the end result is, you really want to pursue all available and cost-effective energy efficiency. And I don't think there's a single household, renter, homeowner, multifamily, condo that should not be using Mass Save. There are, opportunities for all of them. We're talking about homeowners a lot, but, anybody can help improve their efficiency and lower their bills. I do think, if we're talking about the carbon-free home, we have policy goals in this state, and that includes becoming, net zero, however we choose to define that. And so, as combustion of fossil fuel in buildings in the residential and commercial sector is responsible for almost 27% of our emissions in Massachusetts. So realistically, if we are going to get to zero by 2050, we are going to have to remove fossil fuel combustion in homes and buildings. And so really, these technologies are so far advanced from where they were a decade ago. And Mass Save is really supporting them and helping to train the workforce to bring these technologies into their program. So it's a great time to be looking at it.
You brought up, Christy, weatherization and so forth. With climate change, I know that people are looking for homes that are not only green, but resilient for weather. How do those work? I imagine that it's hand in hand, that you can do some energy efficiency upgrades, but you can also ensure that your home is better suited for the climate change implications to come. Nick, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so Alex Wilson, who started, he did a lot of resilient design studies, and he sort of looked at like pre-Hurricane Sandy in New York. He was making a lot of resilient design recommendations to the city. And then when the city had this flood, and they implemented a lot of changes after the disaster happened. And so when people talk about resilient design, Alex has a great way of talking about it, that it's everybody wants resiliency. It's not politicized like climate change and some other things. Everybody wants a resilient home that can last, that we call cruise through power outages. So when we talk about a passive house, you can cruise through a power outage because the house has so little air leakage and it has such good insulation that it'll never drop below 50 degrees, even if there's no heat all winter. So if you build a really good envelope, so like when Chris and are talking about, we're starting with the envelope. If you view the envelope of a regular building as a very leaky bucket and the water is pouring out of it, and you keep pouring energy in to keep heating and cooling that, a resilient building, a passive building, is resilient by nature, and that you've closed up those leaks. You're just trickling in a little bit of heat and a little bit of cooling. And so you're not, when you have a power outage, you can have a very small backup system that can heat or cool it or bring fresh air to it. So resilient buildings, when I look at and I live in Newton, we just built a $200 million high school, and it's not a passive building. Every public building, every public school should be a resiliency center. So when we have big power outages, as climate change worsens and we see more extreme weather, all public buildings should be able to function through power outages. And as we start to put in power walls and other forms of generator backups that are batteries, we should have buildings that can last and function. Right now, we don't have a lot of resilient buildings. So if you have a power outage and you're in a big building downtown, that building is going to overheat or undercool without active systems. So resilient design is really set up so that when you have power outages, you can just use a little bit of a battery backup and you can run that building. You can provide hot water, or you can provide electricity and fresh air, but the building is habitable through those storms. So I don't know if Ara or Chris want to add to that, or.
No, I echo everything that you said. Again, Somerville opens cooling centers during the summers now, which never happened when I moved here 17 years ago. And those are leaky public buildings, and they're spending a lot of money to cool those buildings and make a safe place for people in extreme heat events. And I agree with Nick, as we're building new buildings, making sure that they are built and designed to be resilient is critical for the pocketbook as well as for the climate.
Well, one thing I will add, Cambridge has an interesting part of their net zero goal, which is right now we don't have a good way in power outages to heat a lot of hot water. So if you're in a big multifamily building and you need hot water, say the power's out for 3 days. So what Cambridge is saying now, as I understand it, is you can put in a gas generator for backup power for now, but you have to set it up so that when batteries are scalable, you can put batteries in down the road. So with a lot of our projects, we tell people, yes, maybe we don't, it's too expensive to put in a bunch of batteries now, but let's prepare the house for that. So I think, we can codify resiliency into the building code and require it. And that would be a smart thing for public buildings, even for private homeowners as well. And then even if it's not affordable right now to make that full transition, at least you can require it that it's easy to set it up later on. You don't have to undo a whole bunch of work to make it a resilient building down in the future.
I know that when homeowners you talk to them about green initiatives, I know that the first thing that comes to mind is solar panels. Now, I know there's, can someone delve into solar panels? What kind of, roof, your condition your roof has to be in. Sometimes there are instances where solar panels won't work. Can someone shed some light on those, please?
I'll take that. So solar panels, optimal, facing the south. So we call the sun the big furnace in the sky, right? It's like always there. We know where it is every day of every year. And you want to orient your solar panels ideally at 30 degrees and facing the south. But that every roof has that. So solar companies for free will, if you contact any of the big solar companies in Massachusetts, they'll come out and do what's called a solar study. And they'll tell you, and they can even do it from satellite imagery now, without even coming to your house, do you have a good southern exposure for your roof? And so your roof, if you're going to put solar panels, yes, you want to inspect the condition of your roof. So you don't put solar panels on and then have a leak and have to take them off, right? So we would typically look at, and you say, well, if the solar panels are going to be on there for 25 years, 30 years, you want to have a 25 to 30 year roof underneath those solar panels. But the great thing about solar panels, they pay for themselves in about 7 to 10 years on most homes. So you can get financing, you can put them in now, you can finance it. And I've put in the ones I put on my house are already paid for. Now I'm getting free electricity. So it's kind of a no-brainer in Massachusetts. We have great incentives. A lot of states don't have the incentives and the federal tax credit. So, it's, if you're willing to put up the money up front and finance them, they're a great deal in our state.
I would also ring the efficiency bell again. Thinking about your home as a system and working with a designer and a contractor who can help you do that. If you slap solar panels on your roof without thinking about either your opportunities to reduce your electric load through efficiency or your future electric needs, you will wind up sizing your solar incorrectly, either overpaying or having too small a system. So it's really important for homeowners to think about that. What can you do to reduce the load, and what might you want to do in the future? So I'll use my personal example. I knew I was going to electrify my house eventually, so I oversized my solar system, and that gave me a few extra years of credit so that when I was able to get an electric car, I have a solar system that's sized to charge my car, which with oil and gas prices the way they are right now turned out to be a pretty good decision. However, I didn't think about electrifying my heating, cooling, cooking, and hot water. And so now I have to go back and look at my electric drop and my electric system again. So, don't do what I did. Think about it all together.
And maybe just to build on both of those points, one piece I'd add, because I think there is something sort of instructive about the recent history of solar in Massachusetts as we think about energy efficiency. So, Massachusetts does not have as strong a solar resource as, the Southwestern United States, for instance. despite that, we are one of the leading states on a per capita basis for solar installations. And one of the reasons for that is that the policy support has existed in order to make the economics attractive for customers to adopt solar. And so, it's not sufficient just to try to convince customers to do things on the basis of being green or sustainable. There is a segment of the population that will be enough. But to get to the kind of scale that we need to achieve for all of this, you really need to link up the sustainability message and the environmental benefits of these decisions, along with an attractive economic value proposition for customers. When you can combine those two things, that's a really powerful message that you can then take to the market. And we've used that for years in energy efficiency. We'll continue to use that. And that is, in our view, how you drive scalable adoption of all of these technologies, is that really both need to come into play and both need to be part of the conversation with customers.
Yeah, I totally agree with Chris. NEPA has been working in energy efficiency for over 25 years, and driving market transformation used to be a technology puzzle, and it's not really. A lot of the technologies are there and available, whether you're building new homes or whether you're retrofitting. Now it's really about policy and incentives and regulatory framework catching up to be able to support those. And as Chris said, Massachusetts just has a history of over 15 years at this point in aligning those and really setting up the ecosystem that you need to support homeowners and renters and others to move forward on efficiency and decarbonization.
Now, speaking of decarbonization, I know that the use of concrete is a big source of carbon emissions, and I know that there are new materials coming down the line and new products and techniques and so forth. Nick, as a builder, can you tell us about some of the things that are coming down the line, some alternatives to our traditional building materials?
Yeah, so The Guardian had a great series on the history of concrete as one of the most environmental damaging materials in the history of the world. And they did a great multi-part series on how concrete became what it is today. And it's a really interesting series. So so when you make concrete, you have to run it through what's called, you have to run it through a high heat. To make the stuff that binds concrete, you run it through this kiln, which is blasting gas, okay? So you're basically like, you see a picture of a steel mill, you see these big blast furnaces, you're emitting a huge amount of carbon to make concrete and steel. And so what people are looking at, and when we talk about embodied carbon, is how much carbon does it take to make the material that you see on your site or your house? And concrete and steel, very energy intensive to make them. So how do we reduce that, and how do we replace those with other materials? So concrete is tricky to replace because it's structural capabilities. There are some products coming out like hempcrete. There's other that haven't reached scale yet. I think we'll start to see them. New York State is starting to, I think they're funding an electric kiln for the concrete to make the binding, the clinker stuff that they use to bind concrete. So I think we'll see an electrification of the production of concrete, right? And we might start seeing electric concrete trucks instead of these huge, massive diesels, right? But in the meantime, the way that people are removing concrete, so there's a very interesting building going up now in Boston that's called a CLT building, that Haycon Construction's building, and it's cross-laminated timber. So traditionally, when you see a big multi-level building going up in Boston, you're going to see a steel frame, and then they're going to pour concrete on each floor level, right? Steel frame, concrete, and that's hugely energy intensive. So what they're doing, and this is the future of low carbon building, is they're replacing the concrete and steel from the ground up with cross-laminated timbers, which is basically plywood that gets very, very thick, and they can pre-cut these enormous panels and assemble the building very quickly. So there's actually a NESI tour. NESI is the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association. There's a NESI tour of the CLT building on April 29th. That's going to be pretty exciting to see. But there's 12, 13-story building that they've replaced the carbon emitting materials with a carbon storage. So the general thinking with embodied carbon is wood is good. We want to store the carbon from the atmosphere. Trees do this naturally. They pull the carbon out of the atmosphere and they put it into the wood that we use. So if you can pull a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, build a big building out of all wood, that means the walls, the floors. Now we're using buildings for carbon storage as opposed to emissions. And that's on the commercial side, big multifamily. On the residential side, we really just try to look at how do we remove concrete. And I can go on a long time about this, but the future is CLT. There's a big building in Quebec. In Japan, they're looking at building what's 1,000-foot tall plywood. They're calling it a ply scraper, meaning they're going to build 1,000 feet tall out of wood, which is, so if we can build that big out of wood, we can basically build anything, and then we can get rid of concrete and steel. So that's the future of it. But it's already happening here in our city.
But Nick, can you address possible concerns about using CLT for fire safety? I mean, when you think of concrete and steel, you think of, longer time to burn.
Yeah, so I do residential construction. I don't do big multifamily, but my understanding is that, that there's state fire codes about, how long something has to be exposed to flames before it would fall down. And CLT meets the requirements, I guess, but it's changing, that the requirements the codes weren't written for big CLT buildings. CLT is pretty new for us. So I think the codes are going to have to catch up to that. But in terms of meeting the requirements, they're meeting the requirements. They're going to build, but it's going to be, I think the first few buildings, they're kind of learning how do they deal with the state fire marshal and how do they deal with the fire code regulations. And I think it's going to be a process, like a lot of things where new products, new systems, and the code will have to catch up. So I wouldn't be concerned if they want those ratings, those beams, like you go into an old mill building and it's, these beams, I don't know how thick they are, but they are rated to burn for a long time and still be structurally sound, as I understand it.
Now, talking about a building's envelope, I understand that there's a movement away from spray foam insulation. Is that correct? Or am I mishearing that?
Yeah.
If so, why?
Yeah, there's two main reasons. So number one, spray foam is a petroleum-based product, right? So like we're extracting it, we're using oil, right, to like make a product. So that's one reason. One of the other big reasons is, so I don't know if you've been following in the news, there's been a lot of this about the PFAs, found these forever chemicals that are in our water supply. When you put spray foam in a residential building, you have to spray it with a thermal ignition barrier so that it can't catch fire. It's part of the code. But what's in the stuff that stops it from burning, and it's in a lot of our furnishings as well, they're called fluorinated, halogenated flame retardants. Okay, and they are a forever chemical. They're awful for firefighters. They're awful for us. They are bioaccumulative. And so basically when you put spray foam, and I did this in my own house, and I didn't know that I did this 10 years ago, and I'm thinking now that I know about it, I wouldn't have done it. But in some cases, we really try to minimize the closed cell or the open cell foam usage. And it's because we're putting chemicals. Why would we want to put a chemical that's a bioaccumulative forever chemical in our building, right? And then if that building gets torn down, why would we want that in our landfills? And so we still use closed cell foam, we still use open cell foam, but we really try to use other more environmentally friendly products. There's certain places where it's really the only product that we feel comfortable with.
Now, speaking of codes and regulations, Aaron, do you see any regulations coming down the line that homeowners should be aware of? Any proposals or bills that would play a significant role in trying to get our homes, carbon free?
Yeah, there's a really interesting process going on right now. I'm sure Nick and Chris know about it as well. So last year, there was a major climate law passed into law. And as part of that, the building energy codes, the state building energy codes, were required to be updated with new stretch codes looking at the path to net zero. So the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources is in the process right now of updating the energy codes. And in Massachusetts, there's a base energy code, and there's currently a stretch code. This would update the stretch code and create potentially another tier that cities and towns could opt into. And that is very much an open process. They're in a public dialogue right now, taking public comments. But this would also define what net zero meant in the code's context, and it will impact, every new home and building that's built in the Commonwealth once these codes go into effect. And I don't know, Nick or Chris, if you want to add.
Chris?
I think you covered the process pretty well. All right, it's got to be it's an important part of the conversation. That there are an awful lot of things that we can all do, particularly within energy efficiency, in order to promote good building practices, good weatherization, and retrofit of existing buildings. But ultimately, in order to achieve the Commonwealth's ambitious goals for decarbonization, code is going to have to be looked at. It's going to have to be part of the solution here.
Now, speaking of, oh, sorry, Nick. Go ahead.
I would just want to chime in there because I was recently asked by the Mass Home Builder Association to comment on what and the new code is very much open in proposal, like what it's going to be. And so I wanted to be careful, like staking out a position because it's complicated, because I'm very much an advocate of all electric net zero buildings. But I've been very fortunate that I was able to learn for clients who sort of paid for my education. Most people will not be so lucky when they have to adopt all these new skills. And so I'd like just to mention that when we push for these new codes and we push for stricter ways to build, we do need to support the builders and the carpenters and the trades. And we need to put resources in place so they can get that training. Currently, it's very difficult to build in our state. It's expensive, labor is high, land is high, materials are high, supply chain issues, labor shortages. All these pressures are already on builders, and it's already hard enough to get people to do our work. We need, if they're going to increase the codes, we need to have equal amount of, there needs to be not equal amount, but a huge amount of money made available for trainings and developing this so people can learn how to do this. And I think this gets lost sometimes when people say, yes, we want net zero, but they don't know what that means for the people trying to make it a living. So when we push for these things, I would like to see a lot of funding put aside to develop more trainings and to make this stuff accessible to people that don't have college degrees, maybe don't even have a high school degree, but they know their trade, and now we're changing what their trade requirement is. So I'm all for advocating for this. I'm all for codifying it, but I want to see the support there. So that's my.
I agree. And I've talked about market transformation before and how policy and regulation is driving it. I think workforce development, workforce diversification, we have a generational retirement going on across the workforce. And there's a real opportunity to diversify and make the workforce, everything from builders and people in the trades to code officials, to make it a more equitable and younger and differently trained workforce. And I think that's true for retrofits too. And the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center has a robust new program and stream of funding. I know they're working with National Grid and the other utilities on how to train the workforce that's doing retrofitting, which is often the same workforce that's doing the new construction. So agree.
That's exactly right. I mean, we've spent a lot of this conversation very focused on sort of the demand side of the equation around educating and engaging customers and engendering demand for energy efficiency products and solutions. The supply side is just as important. We have to ensure that collectively, as a Commonwealth, we're investing in the workforce that we're going to need to deliver these outcomes. To Nick's point, I mean, we should be supporting it. I mean, these are good jobs. These are jobs that are going to stay local and allow people to earn a living wage in the Commonwealth while also supporting broader policy goals. It applies to new buildings. It also applies to HVAC and to ensuring that we have sufficient expertise and capacity in state to help homeowners to design these systems and then ultimately to install them. And as Ara mentioned, we're working closely with the Mass Clean Energy Center in order to make those investments. We work with manufacturers, with our trade partners, in order to make sure that that training is both available and accessible to trade allies. And then, we also have our own programs, and I'll just plug quickly what we call the Clean Energy Pathways Program, where, we, along with the other Mass Save program administrators, are going into communities, working with community-based organizations to identify high potential young people. We pay for their internships. with local clean energy efficiency companies. And then we also provide mentoring and career path support in order to help young people just entering the industry right now understand, this isn't just a job for today, but this is really an industry that you should be investing your own time and effort in, because there is a long-term career path here where you can build a successful career and a successful life, meeting the needs that are only growing right here in the Commonwealth.
Well, we have run out of time. I could talk to you folks for hours about all of this. And I like to thank you very much for informing our readers today. And please look for the Globe's other Sustainability Week coverage and for our green building section of the address section coming in June. So thank you very much, and bye.
Thanks,
Very
Eileen.
good. Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Bye.
Take care.